How's it, everyone who's watching this? This is my 67th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at another of the seminars Félix Guattari held between 1980 and 1988, Drive Black Hole. This lecture is organized around translating Freud's concept of the drives into assemblage theory, taking the four elements that make them up and applying them to the subjective, material, territorial, and machinic unconsciouses that we discussed last time. For this episode, I'm using a translation by Taylor Adkins that he posted on his blog Fractal Ontologies. I'll link it in the description below. Without further ado, let's get into it. Guattari begins by describing the way Freud's topographical models evolved over time. Originally, when he was focused on the relationship between the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious, they had a decidedly science-based character. If you've seen my video on the Project for Scientific Psychology, there was a heavy neurological undercurrent, where each was defined in relation to the nervous system and the functioning of neurons. However, eventually, something changed. They started to become what Guattari describes as quasi-anthropomorphic. As you can see in this diagram, lifted directly from Freud, he reorganized his theory around the ego or self that struggles against the pleasure-seeking id and what our author terms the grimacing character of a superego, a punishing moral agency. Guattari notes that the whole system seemed to be something that a madman would come up with, which is why the French school, particularly Lacan, had to clean it up by introducing things like structure and their quasi-algebraic math themes into the unconscious. In Guattari's eyes, the way they tried to make Freud's system more serious was not really all that helpful. Instead, he wants to propose a model that's closer to shamanism, with the idea that there are all sorts of becomings and points of singularity lurking everywhere. To this end, Guattari sets out to break away from what he terms the monotheism of the Holy Trinity, constituted by the basic setup of the ego, superego, and id, with the goal of trying to scavenge elements from Freudianism to develop a more open, pantheist approach to the unconscious. In his words,
"It seems quite legitimate to attempt to see what we can capitalize on with respect to the Freudian contribution, which is an effort worthy of praise."
Beginning this attempt, he turns towards the four components of drives, which we went over in our Freud Friday video on drives and their vicissitudes. Basically, you have a pressure, a source, an object, and an aim. With the first, the drives exert quantities of energy, or libido, onto the subject, pushing them to do certain things. When the ego and sexual drives were distinct, an example of the former was hunger, which constantly generates more and more stimulation until you give in and eat. All of this stems from sources, amongst which the erogenous zones are particularly central. Here, Guattari introduces the notion of propping, which involves early sexual drives leaning on complete objects like egos or other people. This leads directly into the third component, the object itself. It is through objects that the pressure realizes itself. In hunger, for instance, you get rid of pressure by eating something. Like we just saw, Guattari distinguishes between partial and complete objects. The latter can take the form of constituted people, like parents in the Oedipus complex, or the ego itself, like you find in narcissism. The former, on the other hand, brings us back to the notion of erogenous zones that are fragmented and not totalized into any one thing. The final element of drives is the aim. Freud, Guattari tells us, was very careful to separate this from objects. The aim is a kind of direction that the drive moves in, and Guattari describes it as a mode of valorization, representing what the drive values. With these in mind, we can now turn to the problem of representation, a very contentious issue in drive theory. As he says, there is undeniably an opposition between a biological base or infrastructure and a system of representation in the mind. The source and pressure, at least in Freud's account, are in some way organic, but there are also mental implications linked to them, particularly through the object and the aim. In psychoanalysis, as Guattari says,
"The Freudian unconscious, insofar as it conveys fantasies, scenarios, complex phrases, concerns nothing but representation. It does not conserve pressure, source, libido, such as they are."
In the four unconsciouses, Guattari introduced a set of dimensions that he sees as allowing for a way of thinking about the titular concepts without having to get bogged down by representation. These make up what we should call assemblages, arrangements of heterogeneous elements. An interesting aspect of these is that they aren't really tied down in the same way that the psychoanalytic unconscious is. Guattari says that you sort of catch them like the flu, making something out of them, doing nothing, or even being consumed by them. The first dimension of any assemblage, at least at this point in his theorizing, is that of expression. This, linked to the Freudian notion of aim, replaces pressure as the base. As a term, expression is borrowed from the work of Louis Hjelmslew, where it plays the role of one of the planes that make up signs alongside content. Why this matters here lies in Guattari's description of how components on this level knot their related contents together, a relationship that is somewhat reversible, given the way that Hjelmslew holds the two planes to simply be designated as such through their mutual solidarity. On this level, we don't talk about libido as such, but rather desire and its formations. Through knotting contents together, the assemblage is able to set up a system of valorization that directs the way elements are, expressed. In the process, it can generate what Guattari calls far from equilibrium semiotizations, which introduce all those becomings and point of singularities from earlier, and destabilize the stratified levels of the system involved. This constitutes the destiny, or finality of the assemblage, to borrow words Guattari used to describe the aim of drives, additionally taking on many forms. As he himself puts it,
in one case it involves neurosis, in another it involves poetry, in another case it involves a behavioral system in a given social milieu, etc.
With this, we get to the second level, that of content. This isn't simply a passive set of components that gets expressed. Instead, Guattari says that it can work all on its own, although of course in parallel to the first level. We find this in psychosis, where components can take the form of hallucinations and delusions that break away from regular modes of semiotization. This is the material dimension of the assemblage, composed of all kinds of heterogeneous substances. For Guattari, it's through this characteristic that we can say that it corresponds to Freud's source. In his own words,
these heterogeneous substances can include, for example, an oral economy or an anal economy, the economy of the gaze or of listening.
This is specifically a reference to Lacan's understanding of what he calls objet petit-a, or the object cause of desire. The infamous psychoanalysts distinguished between the gaze, the voice, the breast, and feces as partial objects linked to objet petit-a, whilst Guattari expanded its scope to include things like Winnicott's transitional objects. For our purposes, what matters is that content can include things that push people towards these objects. In other words, it acts just like a source. However, Guattari is also careful to stress that content involves more things than just this. It is thus that it acts like an integral or extension of the source. This brings us to territory, which he ties to objects proper. As you can see here, these are only ever metastable. All objects, from the small scale to egos, should be considered as reified things. Instead, there's always the risk of a black hole. In other words, territories always risk collapsing through a process called deterritorialization, where their boundaries break down and they lose their structural integrity. This is what links them to Freud's death drive, which implies a return to an inorganic state free of all stimulation. However, deterritorialization is also often matched with another process, marked at the bottom as reterritorialization. This basically reforms the aerosolic remnants of the old territory into something new. When it comes to things like the aforementioned ego and even larger structures, like that of Oedipus, these are the specific results of a kind of capitalistic territorialization. They aren't some necessary facts of existence, but rather contingent formations. Using the example of so-called primitive societies, Guattari explains that there, the problem of the ego only arises under very specific circumstances. The case he singles out, borrowing from an article by his friend, the anthropologist Pierre Clastre, is that of a singer who goes out into the night all alone, finding an ego through essentially excommunicating themselves, at least for a time. Here he moves on to the machinic dimension, stating,
it introduces singularities, becomings. It propels singularities of different matters of expression, and it's precisely what replaces libidinal pressure.
Like we said at the beginning, far from equilibrium semitizations are tied to the level of expression. However, they are only possible through the pressure exerted by machinisms. This is the realm of things that are truly deterritorialized, hence Guattari's claim that spirits haunt the land. It's kind of a place of possibility, a field of fuzzy possibles, like he says in his next seminar. As discussed in the episode on the fallen consciousnesses, this dimension keeps assemblages open to things like the future, always holding a capacity for change and creative evolution. It's on this note that we arrive at our reworking of drives. At the beginning, he says, we had a system built on abstract quantities of libido that produced psychological representatives through the interplay between a source, object, and aim. Now, by approaching it through the lens of assemblage theory, we have turned that into a kind of far from equilibrium semiotic, which works directly with incorporeals in the form of the singularities and becomings pushed by the machinic replacement of pressure. Libido is gone, replaced by non-quantitative spirits that enter into systems of expression in order to work out desiring production. All of this is illustrated here in a diagram adapted from Guattari's original. Adding on, through this framework, we break the relationship between desire and representation apart. Everything works concretely, outside of a purely fantastical realm. Paraphrasing almost exactly, here, sources are completely heterogeneous, and objects are infinitely differentiated. There doesn't have to be any mediation through things like language and the symbolic. To demonstrate this all, Guattari asks his friend Moni Al-Qaim to recount the case study of a young man who has been in analysis for 8 years, and who lives with his mother. In psychoanalytic terms, he is diagnosed with obsessional neurosis, a condition relatively similar to OCD. To use language more in line with that, his compulsions revolve around the weather. Depending on the temperature, he needs to measure things out in proportions that match. In terms of obsessions, though, they're mainly focused on bestiality and incest. In particular, he really wants to go to church to receive communion, but he struggles with thoughts that appear sinful. In the first session, Al-Qaim tells him that, regardless, he's a good man. Through his work, he supplies his mother with financial stability. Moreover, he says that it isn't really necessary to change. The man's concerned that it isn't normal to live with his parents as age, but Al-Qaim assures him, even against his other psychoanalyst, that it isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is what Guattari's friend calls the stratified portion of the assemblage, which confers a certain amount of stability onto the patient. Going further, the analyst found that the man sees numbers almost like a beacon of light that allows him to stay focused. By encouraging him to take account of the temperature instead of trying to get rid of his behavior, Al-Qaim was able to get him to feel better about himself. In the end, he was able to go out on vacation with friends, no longer being so tied to his mother. He was also able to stop taking antidepressants and could look back on his anxieties without being overwhelmed, discovering a way to find humor in it all. As Guattari says,
The analysts who've seen this guy, in one way or another, necessarily emphasized his relation to the breast, the mother, the repressive situation, the foreclosure of the father, etc.
Al-Qaim, however, was able to examine another kind of assemblage, one less tied to things like the Oedipus complex and the narcissistic economy. In terms of content, Guattari singles out not only the mother, but also monetary elements in Al-Qaim himself. In relation to these, the components of expression found themselves complexified. A seemingly obsessive method of semitization, linked to the patient's numbers, was positively invested in. This breaks with traditional psychoanalysis and the assemblages of other analysts, focused as they are on lack. Moreover, on the machinic level, there were complicated relationships between things like the church and movies. As Al-Qaim relates, he found that editing videos with the patient to make his sessions reminiscent of Woody Allen films helped a lot in getting him to see things humorously. Together, these elements acted as points of singularity that, metabolized by expression, were able to actually help him. Although Al-Qaim goes on to give another case study, I think it's with this that I'd like to conclude, having some understanding of the role of drives in schizoanalysis. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll likely be doing another seminar titled Problems. Until then, bye!